the Europeans began to look to Greece and to Rome as the ideal way of governance, that is to say, democratic states and so forth, with individual free voices. And they began to look at what the Greeks and the Latin authors were saying about Eastern civilizations, such as Persia, and began to take far too literally the way in which the Greek authors were castigating Persian monarchs, for instance, as being Oriental despots and so forth. It was a very easy pit to fall into in many respects. They simply believed what they were reading from these very pejorative approaches from the European authors of antiquity. And so these things became upheld as truisms, things on which to found a European ethnography of their own, I suppose. Only recently I've noticed that a new book has come out called something like Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis, The Battles That Saved Western Democracy. It's quite staggering that at the beginning of the 21st century, people are still publishing that kind of work, and people are still falling for the myth that goes beyond it. And that myth is very damaging.
Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.
Namaste. I'm Mithilesh and Sumit. Welcome you all to a new episode of the Eastern Report. Today, we have noted historian Dr. Lloyd Llewellyn-Jones on our show. Today, we'll discuss Professor Llewellyn-Jones' book, Persian, The Age of Great Kings. Welcome, sir.
Indeed, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for asking me.
The Great Kings of Persia ruled over the largest empire of antiquity. Stretching from Libya to steppes of Asia, Ethiopia to India, at the heart of the empire was the fabled palace city of Persepolis, where the Achaemenid monarchs held court in unparalleled grandeur. From here, Cyrus the Great, Darius, Xerxes, and the heirs passed laws, raised armies, and governed the multicultural empire of enormous diversity. Our understanding of the Persian Empire has traditionally come from the histories of Greek writers such as Herodotus, and as such, over many centuries, our perspective has been skewed by ancient political and cultural agendas. Professor Llewellyn-Jones, however, calls upon original Achaemenid sources, including inscriptions, art, and recent archaeological discoveries in Iran, to create an authentic Persian version of this remarkable great empire of antiquity, the Age of Great Kings. He is a professor and chair in ancient history at Cardiff University. So, Professor Llewellyn-Jones, what made you research ancient Persia and write a book about it?
Well, I started my training as a classical historian, as many people do, of course, So I was studying ancient Greece, and in particular the historiography of ancient Greece. So Herodotus was certainly central to my experience of the ancient world. But I began to question more and more as I was reading Herodotus's account of Persia, how much of it could really be true, because, of course, Herodotus had a very clear agenda in writing his history, and that was, of course, to denigrate the Persians as barbarian forces from the east, and really, of course, to uphold the ideas and values of Athens and basically what he saw as the West. So, unsatisfied really with the approach to Persia that I was getting from Herodotus and other Greek writers as well, I began to dig into more authentic Persian sources where they existed. The task isn't easy because the Persians didn't write any narrative histories in the way that the Greeks did. That's not to say that the Persians didn't know their history or didn't have an interest in their past. It's just that they kind of remembered it differently. So rather than writing it down into what we would now consider to be a Western forensic approach to history in a chronological way. They engaged far more with folk tales, with legend, and with historical events, and sort of amalgamated them into one. And of course, predominantly, they recited these histories, not in written form, but in oral transmission. So it's quite hard, of course, therefore, to try to access an oral tradition which has long dissipated. But I think you can find elements of it. And what I was determined to do, certainly, was to use whatever sources were available to me for the study of Persia from a Persian perspective. And that was the important thing for me. So as you said in your introduction, I used royal inscriptions, which were carved in stone in cuneiform languages. I used the archaeology, which is very rich in Iran. I used as much of the art and iconography as I could. But I also didn't want to entirely dismiss the Greek sources either, because I thought that very often sitting behind the Greek sources, there was perhaps a Persian version going on as well. So what I did, rather than throwing out the Greek sources entirely, is that I tried to look behind them, first of all, at what was the agenda of the Greek writer, and then secondly, what might he have been drawing on that actually was masking an original Persian version behind it. And I found that approach to be very fruitful, in fact. And I hope that I've done a good job in trying to extract as much of Persian history from the Persian perspective as I possibly could.
Well, you have come up with such an original work on Persian history, which has been hidden to the rest of the world. However, Persian history, as we know it, is completely different from that. Why Western historians have failed to capture the true essence of Persian history?
Yes, it's a very important question that which you ask. You know, ever since the 18th century, the Western tradition in history, historiography, has been upheld as being the key to Western civilization. As we moved into the age of enlightenment and ideas of religion changed, you know, and therefore sort of like the medieval world of religious construction disappeared. Instead, we were looking in enlightenment politics at different ways in which the world had approached ideas of rulership, for instance. The Europeans began to look to Greece and to Rome as the ideal way of governance, that is to say, democratic states and so forth, with individual free voices. And they began to look at what the Greeks and the Latin authors were saying about Eastern civilizations, such as Persia, and began to take far too literally the way in which the Greek authors were castigating Persian monarchs, for instance, as being Oriental despots and so forth. It was a very easy pit to fall into in many respects. They simply believed what they were reading from these very pejorative approaches from the European authors of antiquity. And so these things became upheld as truisms, things on which to found a European ethnography of their own, I suppose. So by the time we get to the middle of the 19th century, there is a sharp divide between an East and a West. The West is seen as freedom-loving and democratic. The East is seen as despotic and under the control of tyrants and therefore slaves to the whims of individual rulers, which of course is far from the truth. But that's the trajectory that became important. In the 19th century, as nationalism began to grow, so too this myth of Western superiority grew with it. In the 19th century, for instance, a Scottish writer in Britain, John Stuart Mill, a very famous historiographer and sociologist, he wrote that as an event in British history, the Battle of Marathon which was fought between the Greeks and the Persians in 490 BCE, was of more importance than the Battle of Hastings, which, of course, in 1066 is when the Normans invaded Britain. That's quite a remarkable thing to say, isn't it? You know, that actually the foundation of Britishness actually can go back to the Battle of Marathon, where the Greeks repelled these Persian barbarians. You know, that's the depth in which we're dealing with the ideas of this East-West divide that were going on. And we're still in this mode. Only recently I've noticed that a new book has come out called something like Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis, The Battles That Saved Western Democracy. It's quite staggering that at the beginning of the 21st century, people are still publishing that kind of work, and people are still falling for the myth that goes beyond it. And that myth is very damaging. And I'll try to explain why. For me, what emerges from the work I've done on Persia is the fact, of course, that they do have this vast empire. Now, I'm not an imperialist at all. I don't like the idea of empire. I don't think it's a good way for people to govern. Certainly, I don't like the idea of colonialization. So we have to recognize that the Persians were imperialists. Of course they were. They created a vast empire. The difference is how they then ran that empire. And this is really very different from anything we see in antiquity. So they never imposed, for instance, their own language on the peoples of their empire. They never imposed one religion, a Persian religion, on the people of their empire. They never imposed one particular law on all the peoples of the empire. In fact, they had a very laissez-faire attitude to the running of their empire. As long as the taxes were paid and the treasury was full, then on the whole, different parts of the empire were allowed to operate under the laws and regulations that they'd always used. Now, there were Persian governors in place, of course, to make sure that those taxes were paid. And if there was rebellion or trouble, the Persians could come down very harshly on rebellious subjects. But by and large, it's what I would call an enlightened empire, where actually there was a lot of leeway for individuals to be themselves there. Now, this is very different from if you consider what the Roman Empire was. The Romans imposed the Latin language on everybody. If you were anybody in the Roman Empire, you had to speak Latin. Otherwise, you couldn't get a job in the top echelons of society. Roman architecture is imposed on the places that the Romans conquered. So you can go from Hadrian's Wall all the way over to Syria, and you will see the remains of Romanization plonked onto the landscapes themselves. A Roman dress was required, and so forth. There was a far different attitude to what an empire can be. Why does this matter? It matters because of this so-called inheritance that Europe and the West had, and it's a simulation of European ideals with those of the classical world. When Britain, for instance, at the end of the 18th century, began to build its own empire, it looked to one model, and that, of course, was to Rome. And Roman history, of course, was being taught in all of the great public schools of the day. All of the schoolboys who then became ministers of state and prime ministers had all learned about this way of governance. And of course, the Persians had been written out of their education. So they never even thought that there might be an alternative version to running an empire, a far more liberal version to running an empire. So the result is, of course, that we have empire building in the 19th and 20th centuries modeled on one of the most grotesque and harsh empire buildings in history, that of the Romans and not of the Persians. And it's a great tragedy, you know, that Persian history had not been taught in the schools of the 19th and 20th century, so that European colonizers, it wouldn't have stopped colonization or empire building. But I think for millions and millions of people around the globe who were under the control of, say, the British or the French or the Germans, might have experienced a more dignified way of living under empire, at least. So therefore, I think it's important that we acknowledge, that the Persians did things very differently, and they might have provided us with a blueprint for empire or for rulership, which is a little bit more feasible, as ugly as empire ever is.
You spoke about how in the Roman civilization, for instance, language or different code of dress was imposed if you really wanted to go in the upper echelons administration. Uh, for instance, I mean, it reminds me of how Constantine adopted Christianity just because he wanted to extend his power and show his might. Uh, but do you see similar kind of, probably not, right? I mean, so how much did religion actually play as a projection of power in the Persian history?
In the Persian Empire, very little indeed. There was very little impact of Persian religion on the rest of the empire. And in fact, to be honest, trying to define what Persian religion was in the empire period is very difficult. There has been a tradition of saying, oh, ancient Persia was Zoroastrian. Well, certainly it became Zoroastrian in the Sasanian period, but that's a good 500 years later than the period I'm dealing with. At the very best, I could say that maybe we're dealing with some kind of proto-Zoroastrianism. Certainly, King Darius the Great, on his inscriptions, talks all the time about Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, the supreme god of the Iranian pantheon. But there is no mention, for instance, of a prophet of Ahura Mazda. So there is no mention whatsoever in any Achaemenid inscriptions of Zarathustra at all. So I am very reluctant to say that the Achaemenid kings were Zoroastrian, let alone trying to take that faith anywhere else in the empire. That wasn't part of their system at all. So it's very different to the Roman system, who had a huge pantheon of gods, which had matured over the centuries, of course, and certain temples and rituals, which they installed all over their empire then. So it's a very different landscape, really.
I mean, obviously, the Persian Empire and the Byzantines were at constant loggerheads with each other. How did the Byzantines influence the style of governance for the Persian Empire?
With the Byzantines?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this is a much later period than my book deals with, but I think there was a great deal of diplomatic correspondence and diplomatic interaction between the Byzantines and the Sasanian Shahs. We know that for certain. And so it wasn't all warfare and the clashing of cultures at all. There was a lot more negotiation going on, an exchange of ideas in this period than has previously been thought. My good friend and colleague, Matthew Canepa, has written a wonderful book called The Two Eyes of the Earth, which really deals with this cross-fertilization of ideas that went on between the Western Empire, between Rome, Byzantium, and Persia. But my book really deals with the formation of the empire in the BC period. So there's a different world going on there.
In your book, you talk about Cyrus the Great, who created one of the greatest empire that Earth ever saw. So how was he able to do that during the high might of Ashur Banipal?
It's one of the great questions. Is what drove Cyrus the Great to have so much success and so very quickly as well? Because just within one generation, Cyrus took the Persians from being a small tribe in southwestern Iran to being the beginnings of a superpower. And sometimes, these figures just emerge in history who are able to have the charisma to galvanize people into believing what they do. I'm not a great fan of big men theory in history, but I have to concede that when it comes to Cyrus, he must have had something really very special about him in order to do that. He was a man, obviously, of incredible ambition and a man also very willing to take risks, it appears to me. He clashed with the very powerful northern Median tribes, first of all, and took over their lands. And when he took over their lands, he also took over swathes of territory which went across the Zagros Mountains and into what is nowadays northern Iraq and even up to the borders of eastern Turkey as well. And having inherited that amount of land, he didn't then think, oh, let's go home. He actually thought, oh, well, this is a really good way for me to go even further west. And so going to the ends of the Median lands in eastern Turkey, he then marched across central Anatolia until he got to the richest city in Western Asia Minor at the time, and that's the city of Sardis, which within a year he had conquered and brought to its knees. And that meant suddenly that all the Greek-speaking city-states of Asia Minor, modern-day Western Turkey, suddenly fell to these new military upstarts from the east. No wonder the Greeks went into trauma about this, because suddenly they did see this huge army coming from the east, conquering everything. So then that was a second opportunity for Cyrus to say, okay, I've made my mark. We're now a very wealthy state. I'll go back to Persia. But no, instead, he swung his army around, and rather than going home, he went down into Mesopotamia between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, and his aim was for Babylon itself. Now, Babylon was the super city of antiquity. Long before Rome, of course, it was the one metropolis, the true metropolis on earth. It was a huge, huge urban compound. Many, many different types of people lived there from all over the ancient world, essentially. And Cyrus took that. Now, his propaganda machine is really interesting because we have the so-called Cyrus cylinder, which still exists in the British Museum, which is a document which talks how the Babylonians joyfully opened the doors of Babylon for his soldiers to walk in, and he entered peacefully into Babylon, and he worshipped the Babylonian gods, and the Babylonian gods were glad to see him. That's a wonderful bit of spin doctoring, of course, on Cyrus's part too. It is true that the Babylonians opened the gates of the city to welcome Cyrus, but only because they'd learned a very sharp lesson just beforehand. Because as he was marching his men towards Babylon, he stopped at a city called Opis, which is just about 50 miles north of Babylon, and he let his troops destroy the city, completely destroyed it. Not one brick was left standing on the other. Every member of the male population of the city was killed. All the women and children were enslaved. So this really was the incentive for the Babylonians to open their doors to Cyrus, lest they suffer the same kind of fate. So we see something of the man, the real mind of the man, behind the later image that he wanted to have portrayed. And I think today in Iran, the Persians are very proud of Cyrus, and the Iranians regard him as the creator of the first Bill of Human Rights. That's a misnomer. There was no such thing in antiquity. But he did, of course, free exiled peoples from their exile, so the Jews and many other types of people who had been brought to Babylon by the Babylonian kings over a series of 100 years. He allowed them to go back to their homelands to rebuild their lives again. But that's not exactly what I would call a human rights movement. Cyrus still believed, of course, in the power of the military. He still believed, of course, in slavery as well. And so that it's a bit of a misnomer. Does this matter? As far as I'm concerned, if the young Iranian people want to have Cyrus as a hero, let them have Cyrus as a hero, because I think it's important for them.
You talk about how vicious Cyrus was, or when dealing with his opposition. Obviously, we do hear about immortals as a core of the army, or Persian army. So, what do you think led to creation of such a special unit, which is the force, and how different they were, or how would you judge immortals were really compared to the other special forces or units at that point of time?
Yes, it's an interesting question. the force that we know of as the immortals, which comes from a Greek word, athanatoi, which means literally those without death. They're very, very hard to pin down in the Persian sources, unfortunately. And I'm not entirely sure if they really were a sort of a special elite force of fighting men, a kind of, bodyguard. The Greeks say that basically, if one of them died, immediately they were replaced. So there were always 10,000 fighting men around the core of the king. This may well be a Greek fantasy, of course, and the idea that, these men seem to be unending, never dying, they're always there. But it's very hard to pin down in any of the Persian sources, even a Persian name for this brigade. I can't really find it. There are lots of sort of etymological tricks and twists and turns that I could take to try to pin down this particular bodyguard, if you like, but it's very hard to do so. We do, of course, have representations from the walls of Susa of these very elegant liveried soldiers wearing these beautiful garments and holding weaponry, which is exquisitely made. Bows, for instance, which end in duck heads, silver spears with pomegranate finials and so forth. And people have said, oh, these must represent the immortals. But actually, it's very hard to bring those two things together. So unfortunately, on the subject of the immortals, on this crack force bodyguard, the jury has to remain out for now.
I'm the kind who is a friend of what is right. I'm no friend what is wrong. This quote is attributed to Darius I. Tell us something about him.
Yes, the great Darius I was a really remarkable man. He came to power through military tactics. Actually, he was a usurper of the throne. He had no official right to sit on the throne whatsoever, but he was one of the greatest propagandists of history, I think, and carved into a huge mountain in the northeast of Iran at Bazyntine. He put an inscription which talked about his accession to the throne. And in it, he essentially tells an enormous lie in which he had put down a rebellion which had arisen, and somebody had killed the legitimate king of Persia, and that he had stepped in to save Persia from turning into chaos. In fact, what we now know, of course, is that Darius himself was responsible for killing the previous king, that is Bardia, the younger son of Cyrus the Great, and Darius seized the throne for himself. It was a court coup, essentially, a military coup from the inside. And he goes out of his way in this huge inscription to talk about his legitimacy to the throne. So he talks all the time about how the god Ahura Mazda aided him to get the throne. It was Ahura Mazda's choice for him to become king. So he uses the figure of the god as a justification for his usurpation of the throne. On more practical basis, we see suddenly that he marries all of the available women of the house of Cyrus the Great. So he marries Cyrus's two daughters, he marries the wives of the previous kings, all of which, of course, help give him legitimacy as the new king of Persia as well. The first 2-3 years of his reign were pretty chaotic, with many, many rebellions against his accession to the throne, but he managed to put them all down very successfully. And from there on in, his reign was one of incredible order. Darius was one of the great bureaucrats of history. The ancient Persians, just like the modern Iranians, loved red tape. They really did. They were bureaucrats to the core. Darius was the king of all bureaucrats, I suppose. He established road systems, which were very sophisticated, unsurpassed communication systems, including things like a Pony Express, so that messages could travel from one end of the Persian Empire to the other in a matter of weeks. By far the most sophisticated road system that antiquity ever saw. He dug a canal from the Nile to the Red Sea, which meant that trade could go around the Persian Gulf and into India. So he opened up the empire. He also divided it into numerous satrapies as well. So these are government areas put under the head of a satrap or a sort of viceroy or vice regent. And he also set the limit on the tax that was imposed on each society. And Darius's law, the old Persian word is data, Darius's data went throughout the empire as well. So he was very much, I suppose, what we would call a control freak, but employing administrative systems correctly and authentically and skillfully to hold this empire together. Really, under Darius, the empire grows to its biggest extent. It doesn't really swell much after Darius. He tries to bring in new parts of the world to the empire. He goes on a march into Scythia, into modern-day southern Russia, Ukraine. But unfortunately, the heavy snows of winter defeats him and he has to retreat. And that's really the last time that the Persians try to bring new territories into the empire. Really, all the other kings follow Darius in trying to administer their empire and try to hold it together. And you can imagine that with the size of the empire that you described at the beginning, that was a formidable task in itself, of course.
Tell us something about the great King Xerxes. What was his role in the continued conflict between Greeks and Persia?
Xerxes is known to us primarily from the accounts of Herodotus in the wars that went on between Persia and Greece in 480 and 479 BC, when Xerxes led a huge army into northern Greece and then down into Attica. Its aim was to destroy Athens and to bring Greece, which was very much an outpost of empire in the far western peripheries of the Persian world, of course, to heel. Now, of course, Herodotus writes Xerxes as a mad despot, out of control, having no sense of self-awareness at all. The reality, I think, is very different. And if you really think about the Persian campaign into Greece from a Persian perspective, well, by and large, Xerxes actually completed what he set out to do. He killed a king, the Spartan king Leonidas, at the Battle of Thermopylae, no mean feat. And of course, he actually did destroy Athens. That was the main part, real main emphasis of his campaign. So, on two accounts, it's mission accomplished. He didn't manage to quell Greece and bring it under control. And really, the reason why he left Greece was not really through humiliation or defeat. It's because at that moment, the city of Babylon broke out in rebellion. And Babylon was more important to the Persians than Greece would ever be. And so Xerxes and his main army retreated to Babylon to quell that insurrection, because they could not afford ever to lose Babylon, of course. So, of course, for the Greeks, Herodotus and others wrote this desertion of the land of Greece as a great victory for them. Xerxes slinking away by night, defeated, humiliated. It wasn't quite the story that Herodotus gives us. Now, neither, though, do I want to denigrate the very heroic Greek effort against the Persian superpower. It really was something spectacular that many of these small Greek cities came together. But it is important to remember that the battle between Greece and Persia was not as holistic as people think, because many Greek city-states actually fought for the Persians. Greece was not a united nation at this stage. There was no concept of that whatsoever. And many Greek city-states, including Macedon, Thrace, down into Boeotia, Thebes, and so forth, and even in the Peloponnese, a city-state like Argos, thought that their future would be far better with Persia in control than with, say, Athens or Sparta. And so we know we need to get rid of that myth that what we're dealing with here is a war between East and West. It simply is not that easy at all.
Why do you think the Persian Empire always focused towards expanding their empire to the west? Why didn't they focus more on expansion towards east?
That's a good question. And in fact, we know that they did have a great focus on the east. Unfortunately, it's an accident of history that most of our evidence is Western based because of the predominance of Greek sources. But the eastern part of the empire was to some extent more important to the Persians than the western frontier, particularly the huge satrapy of Bactria was extremely important to them. It was very wealthy. It had gold, lapis lazuli, and so forth. We're talking here of the area of Afghanistan, for instance. And also, of course, the other really important area for them was northern India, particularly around the Punjab, which was conquered by Darius. And in fact, I often think that if his forces in 490 had not had to be withdrawn from India to quell insurrections in the West amongst the Greeks in Asia Minor, I think probably more of India would have fallen to the Achaemenids than we finally see. It would be possible for him to have got down to the Ganges, for instance. He never did. But we should always remember that actually the Indian-Persian relationship was very, very strong. Parts of India, of course, as I say, were part of the empire, and we see Indian representatives at Persepolis bringing their diplomatic gifts. But the cultural exchange that goes on between these two great civilizations never really faded away. And we know that under the Achaemenids, there was a regular exchange in diplomatic messages and also diplomatic gifts as well. So some of the things that we find mentioned in Persia, which are clearly of Indian origin, include things like rhinoceros horns, parrots for the first time, a reference to a tiger is made for the first time in Persia, and this is clearly Indian tigers, and also certain Indian spices, perfumes, and poisons as well were all really high status gifts within the Persian court too. And it's been said by Indian historians that Maurya India, the architecture of Maurya in India, is very heavily influenced by Achaemenid architecture. And I think you can see that in things like the bull capitals and so forth that we see under Ashoka and so forth too. So I think that there's a lot of good work to be done on the transmission of ideas between India and pre-Islamic Iran. There's a lot more to be done on that world, which I think is very exciting. And I also think there's a lot of good work to be done, and I'd like to do this in the future, on the epic traditions of India and Iran as well. In particular, I think I would love to do a comparative study of the themes and motifs that we find in Mahabharata and in Shahnameh, for instance, the two great national epics. I know there's a great distance between them in time and space, but I think there are motifs which actually go back to the, after all, the Indo-Iranian origins of both these societies as well. So I'm keen to do that in the future.
It's very interesting that you talk about, the cultural exchange. When I was reading about the life of Cyrus, obviously Helphagus, he helped Cyrus. Similarly, I could relate how Chanakya helped Chandragupta Maurya
Precisely.
the Mauryan Empire. So that story was very relatable to me.
Yeah,
so,
and I think that we'd find a lot more if we began to look into these links. I think storytelling traditions between India and Iran, I think, are very sympathetic. I think there's a lot that could go on there.
how much did obviously, we had the Assyrian Empire, and then came Cyrus and Darius and Xerxes. So, how did the economic? I mean, economy does play a very key role in expanding and growing the empire. How did the focus change over the years, and how did they expanded the economic influence of the empire?
Yes, economics, of course, is what drives empires. No matter what you say about ideologies, it's always, when it comes down to it, it's about money and the exchange of goods, of course. And this is why it's important for any empire builder to take their borders to the maximum space that they can get. There was, of course, nothing on earth to compare with the Persian Empire. There were no rivals to the Persian Empire in terms of scale at all. So unlike in the Byzantine world, that we have Byzantium and we have the Sasanians, two very wealthy superpowers. There's nothing like this in the Achaemenid world at all. They are the superpower. They are the wealthiest state in the world. And therefore, of course, they can control all of the variety of wealth that they find, not only in luxury products, silver, gold, lapis, turquoise, and so forth, perfumes and whatever it might be, but also, of course, in the necessities, and that is, of course, crops. We're really feeling that strain now, aren't we? Within the Ukrainian crisis, what happens when we don't have crops, going around the world? Egypt, for the Persians, as for every civilization, was the breadbasket of antiquity, and therefore they gained all of the benefit of that. But of course, there were huge swathes of the Persian Empire which were economically completely redundant as well. You only have to think of the huge desert spaces, the steppes, the mountain areas, which gave nothing whatsoever. So it wasn't all about lucrative drilling of natural sources. The thing that really changes in the Achaemenid Empire is the use of coinage for the first time. So coins, bullion was first created in Sardis under Croesus. And the Persians, certainly in the western part of the empire, realized the value and the virtues of having transportable wealth. And so they created two forms of coinage. There were silver coins, which were called sigloi, and there were gold coins called darics, which had the images of the great kings on them. And we see the distribution of these coins widely around the Mediterranean and into the Levant as well. So thousands and thousands of these silver coins, for instance, have been found in Athens. So it means that there's a currency that's going around the empire. And by the time we get to the High Empire, that is about 400 BCE, there is a desire to utilize silver more than any other goods. So there is a shift in what we see as being the desirable exchange. And therefore, of course, we have weightings and an exchange rate as well. And that means that around about 400 BC, the interest rates in Persia suddenly went crazy. And there you get into a new world, really, which hadn't been in existence before, where we're actually having to deal with weights and values and a system of exchange of silver, too. So this is what really the Persian Empire brings into the modern world that we don't have in the Assyrian or Babylonian or any of the previous world empires at all. That is an increasing usage of coinage and the profits, but also the pitfalls that comes with that as well.
Do you think the importance of Red Sea as a trade, I mean, it did played an important role in the trade and economic. So, do you think it did play the same role as it played in the later part of the? Because they obviously captured the Egypt rather late, right? So, how did they capture their trade via Red Sea?
Egypt is a very early conquest, actually, 522, under Cambyses, Cyrus's son. And it's Darius who orders the construction of a canal from the Nile through to the Red Sea. Now, that's an amazing thing in itself, isn't it? I mean, to dig a huge canal across that landmass to connect the Nile to the sea is important. So Darius knew that circumnavigation, therefore, of the Arabian Peninsula into the Persian Gulf and around into India was therefore possible. And there's no doubt that he must have exploited it because of that reason. Now, we're waiting for the archaeology, really, to confirm that there were Achaemenid settlements, for instance, in Oman, in the south west of Persia, around the coast of Persia, and of course into northern India, or even maybe into the coast of western India as well. Where we can find some of these trading areas, we will know for certain. So I don't want to anticipate that, but I can tell you now that certainly we found lots of evidence for Sasanian trading posts all along the Red Sea into Oman, southern Iran, and into India as well. So I think if the Sasanians are using it 500 years later, I'm not at all surprised if there were Achaemenid origins there. Certainly, I think that Darius also dug another canal in the north of Greece as well. And what he was trying to do quite clearly was to circumnavigate as far as he could the Mediterranean and the Nile, certainly, but also then with this very lucrative trading route down into India too. I think that's exactly what he was trying to do.
The Egyptian kings said they were the gods, while the Persians presented themselves as a viceroy of God. Is it the reason why they were always in conflict?
Yes, the Achaemenid great kings never saw themselves as gods, unlike, say, Egyptian pharaohs, but they did see themselves as God's viceroy, yes. So they were ordained to rule by God, that they were given the support of God in the creation and the holding together of the empire. Therefore, rebellion against the king was seen as rebellion against God. And so there was a kind of religious dimension to the maintenance of the harmony of the empire itself. And Darius and certainly Xerxes used this ideology of rebellion being sort of a form of blasphemy against the gods as a means of control. It's something, of course, that many subsequent empires have built on themselves as well. The politicalizing of religion in that respect. Yes. But they were never seen as gods in their own right.
How would you say the Achaemenid Empire influenced the later Persian empires?
I think that the Achaemenid Empire became the blueprint for the knowledge of what is possible, I think. It's quite clear that the Sasanians knew their Achaemenid history, and they modeled themselves very closely on the Achaemenids. The Sasanians came from the same part of Iran as the Achaemenids, from Fars province. And of course, at sites like Persepolis and Naqsh-e-Rustam, which is the burial ground of the Achaemenid kings, the Sasanian monarchs put up their own monuments in direct proximity to the images of the Achaemenid great kings. So it shows a very self-conscious awareness, and almost a direct line was trying to be established between them. Now, I think after the Arab invasion, the memory of the Achaemenid Empire disappeared. It just wasn't around. But of course, it was preserved in things like Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, where unfortunately, we don't have a kind of a chronological history of ancient Persia, but we do get a legendary, mythical history of Persia, in which figures like Dara or Darab, the kings of Iran, are clearly modeled on the ancient Darius the Great, Darius II, or Darius III. So we hear traces of Achaemenid Iran in medieval Iranian poetry and epic writings. But now in Iran, the Achaemenid past is remembered with great pride and intense fondness. I think that many young Iranians, in particular, quite exhausted by living within a very harsh theocracy, are looking at their pre-Islamic Persian heritage with great dignity. And maybe they see in the history of ancient Iran, of ancient Persia, an aspiration for them, a time when Iran was taken seriously, when it was admired throughout the world, when it was a world superpower, when it was producing art of the highest quality. So I think young people in Iran are looking back at the Achaemenid period with great pride and with great also a certain tinge with sadness as well, I think. And I think it's important for people to have their histories and to acknowledge their part in the histories. One of the great tragedies for me is that really inside Iran, not many young people are writing histories of Persia because, ancient Persian history is not well taught within Iran. It's not part of the government's policy at all. And this is a great shame because no foreigner, as much as I love Iran and I love my Iranian history, I'm an outsider still to Iran. I'm still writing a history of Iran when really I want to hand it over to a young Iranian to do. That's the way in which we should be remembering our past as well. If we truly want to access a Persian version of the pre-Islamic Persia, we need a Persian to do it, really, with all of the skills of a trained historian, of course. So it's going to take a few generations, maybe, for that to happen. But I'm hopeful that one day young Iranians will start writing their own histories from a balanced perspective, not a nationalist history, okay, not a fantasy, but a balanced account of the pre-Islamic past would be wonderful to see.
Talking about the language of Persia, the old Persian during the time of Darius and Xerxes. So, is there any similarity between Sanskrit, the old Sanskrit, the Vedic Sanskrit, and the old Persian? Is there any common ancestor of both?
Oh yes, most definitely. So both Sanskrit and Persian, Old Persian, are Indo-European languages, of course, and so they share a lot of words and sound values. In fact, I can give you a few of them from the Avestan language, which of course is the ancestor of modern-day Iranian and Sanskrit. So, for instance, the word for horse in Avestan is aspa. In Sanskrit, it's asva. Yeah. The word for cattle is the same in both, which is pasu. Pasu in Sanskrit and in Avestan. The word for a cow in Avestan is gav. In Sanskrit is go. And then, of course, we have woman is jani in both languages. Brother in Avestan is brata. In Sanskrit is bharata. Yeah. So there are a great many linguistic, etymological similarities between the two languages. And Indologists have told me that there's also a lot of good work to be done on exploring the connections between the texts of the Avesta, which are the oldest religious texts from Iran, and of course the Rig Veda, because many of the themes that arise in Rig Veda, they say, can be found in the Avesta as well. That's not my speciality. I wish I knew more, but it would take me another lifetime to learn Avestan as well. But yes, I think this connection is very strong.
So, what kind of new archaeological evidence are you getting, or literary evidence are you getting that is really changing our viewpoint about about Achaemenid Empire and the later empires?
Yes, so there's a lot of really good archaeology going on within Iran itself, but also outside of Iran, of course, in the bigger part of the empire. So we're discovering some of these Persian roads, which were so important to them. But even at very well-known sites, which have been excavated for many, many decades, such as Persepolis, recent investigations, for instance, have discovered a whole new wall, a huge gate, which was built by Cyrus, which actually predates the rest of Persepolis by at least 50 years. We've discovered evidence for the formal gardens, the paradisoi, that were planted around Persepolis. We also found evidence, for instance, of the original sort of village around Persepolis as well. So, there are new finds in areas which haven't been touched before, but also new finds in areas which are really well explored. So I'm very hopeful that in the next century, Iran's archaeology is going to open up even more interesting information for us. It's a very, very rich field, I'm glad to say.
Sure. So what are the different projects are you currently working on?
Well, at the moment, I'm working with the British Museum on a big exhibition which is opening next year in April, which is called Golden Rule: Luxury and Power from Persia to Greece. And so I've written the catalogue for the Persian section of the exhibition for that. I'm also at the moment creating 2 complete Persian garments, reconstructions of the kind of garment that Xerxes would have worn when he was traveling on horseback, but also when he was sitting in court, because, of course, textiles don't survive in the archaeology. And one of the things that the Persians used to articulate their power and their status was clothing. So it would be wrong to have an exhibition on luxury without clothes being seen. So I'm working with some really very great textile people and some costume makers in recreating some of these garments for display in this huge exhibition. And then beyond that, I hope certainly to return to some more Persian subjects in the future. But right now, my new book I'm working on is about Cleopatra, so something very different.
Yeah, very interesting discussion. Thank you for joining us.
You're very welcome.
It was really a pleasure to have you. We wish you all the best for
Thank
your
you so much.
future projects. And looking forward to inviting you again, maybe in the future.
Anytime. I'll be very happy to. Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.